He serves as a professor of theology, senior professor of theology at the Pontifical Catholic University of Argentina in Buenos Aires. He's worked with CELAM over the years. He's also currently serves on the Vatican's International Theological Commission. And the format of our evening, we're going to introduce Father Galli with a few comments from my colleague and colleagues Hosman Ospino and Raphael Luciani. Raphael and Hosman will help place his work in context and to give us, prepare us in a sense to have a proper appreciation of the kind of creative work that Father Galli has been doing. My colleague, Professor Hosman Ospino, born in Colombia, did his PhD. I'll be brief since we have 3 introductions. PhD in theology and education here at Boston College. Indeed, I was privileged to teach Hosman, and he has gone on to make me famous as one of my students. He and his wife Guadalupe are the proud parents of William and Victoria. He's been the principal investigator in 2 major studies. One looking at Catholic parishes in this country, and especially with Hispanic populations and the quality of ministerial service within those parishes, and has published that. It's been a groundbreaking piece of research on the quality of Hispanic ministry in our Catholic parishes throughout the country, and now most recently has been the primary investigator with Dr. Patty Weitzel O'Neill, the head of our Roach Center in Catholic Education here at Boston College, doing a similar kind of study on how well or how poorly our Catholic schools are serving the Hispanic population. And both of those studies have been published, and Hosman is currently working on a new book to be published by Fordham Press, where he will bring together the insights of that research on both of those studies, but also the gift that multicultural faith is to the life of American Catholicism. So that's our friend Hosman. And then Professor Raphael Luciani, visiting professor here at Boston College, and just a great gift to us. Himself and his colleague Felix Palazza have been such a breath of fresh air to our discourse and to our resource here at Boston College, theologically and pastorally, which is their great passion. Professor Luciani holds a doctorate in theology from the esteemed Pontifical Gregorian University in Rome. Currently, he holds the rank of full professor at the Jesuit Catholic University of Andres Bello in Caracas. He also holds rank at the Pontifical Salesian University in Rome, is a visiting professor of theology here at the School of Theology and Ministry. He has been director of the School of Theology at the Jesuit Catholic University in Caracas and chair of the theology department at the Salesian Pontifical University in Rome. I'm presently trying to work my way through the most recent book of his that I have, Regresar a Jesu de Nazareth, Returning to Jesus of Nazareth, which I think is about the best idea we have. Jesus is still the best thing we've got. So returning to Jesus seems like a wonderful strategy at this point in time. Hosman and Raphael, my professor colleagues, will introduce Father Galli with some comments introductory. Then Father Galli will follow with his presentation. Then we're going to open it to some conversation among yourselves, and we'll come back together then for more conversation with Father Galli. So without further ado, Raphael is going to speak to us first. Raphael.
Thank you so much for the invitation, and it's an honor and so happy to be here with you. I would like to share 3 ideas to frame the pastoral and theological option of Pope Francis, which is very interesting because we are in another culture, and to know his framework, theologically and pastorally, will help us to understand where he is leading the church to. So a first point, brief point, it's a theological or pastoral option of Francis. A second point, popular and relational, but not populist. And a third point, a missionary discipleship conversion in light of Aparecida. So the first point. In Evangelii Gaudium and in the discourse he delivered during his trips to South America, the Pope made clear his theological pastoral option. A special interest is also to see his role during the Aparecida document, that is the Fifth General Conference of the Bishops of Latin America and the Caribbean. As regards its theology, the Pope's option draws its initial inspiration from the theology of the people, which was one of the several types of liberation theology developed in Latin America in the wake of the Council. And as regards to its pastoral approach, his option finds its origin in the renewal process impelled by the popular pastoral ministry that was proposed by the Argentine bishops when they met in San Miguel in 1969, trying to adapt the conclusions of the Second General Conference of Latin American Bishops in Medellin, Colombia in 1968. Influenced by the Argentinian theologians Lucio Hera and Rafael Tello, Francis understands the pastoral ministry and theology must form a unity. And faithful to Latin American theological method, the Pope understands that praxis always comes first and that theological reflection follows as a second step. As he states in Laudato Si, theological and philosophical reflections on the situation of humanity and the world can sound tiresome and abstract unless they are grounded in a fresh analysis of our present situation. A second point is something that I've heard a lot, especially in the US, stating that the Pope is a populist and not popular, and the word popular and people has many different meanings here. So it's important to know what people popular means in our context. The theological perspective that appears in the teaching of Francis is not a populist one. Rather, it responds to the world of popular reality. That is, the lived experience of the poor people, and I say together poor people because it's not only the individuals, but as a common subject or communal subject, el pueblo. In agreement with the Latin American theologies of liberation, he understands that, quoting Evangelii Gaudium, the option for the poor is primarily a theological category, not a sociological or political one. Because, and he says again in the Evangelii Gaudium, this is very interesting, the kingdom of God as proposed by Jesus is not about living a private religion or an intimate liturgical relationship with God, which is very typical in our contexts, reducing the religion to a very intimate and a private and especially a liturgical experience. But about creating, and this is very interesting for our culture again, creating interpersonal bonds. I find this very impelling into our postmodern societies. Interpersonal bonds, where there are family, fraternity, peace, justice, and dignity for all. Because God redeems, as remembering also the Evangelii Gaudium, not only the individual person, but also the social relations existing between humans. So this poses a challenge, because we could say that we are being saved as we become people with the peoples, not by living an intimate, again, and an individual relationship without fraternity. So fraternity is a space where we are being saved continuously. So the notion of people acquires a theological status, because just as we listen to our Father, he said in Santa Cruz, Bolivia, so also we listen to the faithful people of God at the same level. Interesting. So both academic and pastoral theologians must therefore become inculturated in their respective peoples, pueblos. A third and a last brief point, it's understanding him through the light of Aparecida, a missionary discipleship conversion. This popular and relational vision of salvation that Francis embraces requires what Lucio Hera calls pastoral conversion and a change of mentality. The Pope draws new inspiration here from the contributions of the 2007 Conference of Latin American and Bishops and the Caribbean, which is called Aparecida, because it was celebrated in Aparecida in Brazil. As Francis said when he met with the Bishops' Conference in Rio de Janeiro in 2013, and I quote, "The missionary discipleship that Aparecida proposed to the churches of Latin America and the Caribbean is the path that God wants us to follow today." Interesting. It's not one path, it's the path that God wants us to follow today. This approach responds to a theology of historical salvation which holds that the condition for salvation is not being Christian, but being human. Because Christian praxis is first and foremost being neighborly, something that we forget a lot in our daily living, being neighborly. Such an approach embodies a mystical fraternity that requires of us an ethical connection with reality and an intimate and personal contact, and then I quote Evangelii Gaudium too, with the homes and the life of the people. We sometimes talk a lot about a person from a different culture than ours, but we have never maybe been in a personal contact, have a personal friendship with someone different than ourselves or our common culture. So our theology and the life of the church is like this framework that permits us to understand where his papacy wants to take the church. To understand this, the popular hermeneutics of Francis employs the paradigm of the poor people's culture, la cultura del pueblo pobre, for that is where human interdependence and a real sense of belonging, a very important question again for our hyper-postmodernism, belonging still exists. And then he says in Bolivia in 2015, what allows us to obey the commandment of love is that rootedness, which means also belonging, in the barrio, in the land, in the trade, in the guild. It is that recognition of oneself in the face of the other, that nearness again, neighborliness, nearness, to everyday existence with all its misfortunes and its daily acts of heroism. Our faith is founded not only on ideas or concepts, but on genuine encounter among persons. Having settled this, Francis presents us with a great challenge, that of, quoting again Evangelii Gaudium, inserting ourselves into God's faithful people and the concrete needs of the present day, while avoiding the dangers he pointed out to the bishops in Rio de Janeiro in 2013, myopic activism, pastoral functionalism, academic irrelevance, those who live in their own offices without having any encounter with those to whom they are talking, and ecclesiastical clericalism. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Rafael. And what a wonderful moment for us to be in conversation about Pope Francis's intellectual roots and how his pontificate and vision are inviting us into a new way of embracing the identity, the Catholic identity in the 21st century. I want to entitle my brief remarks in anticipation to Father Galli's lecture, Welcoming the Vision of Pope Francis in the United States of America through a Latina lens. A new paradigm shift is taking place in the United States, and all we have to do is just look around in our churches, our communities, universities, pastoral centers. Something's happening. Demographic changes, cultural changes, ecclesial changes. We in the United States have welcomed the 21st century in the middle of a paradigm shift that is inviting us to be church in a new way, inviting us to embrace Catholicism and the Christian tradition in a new way. And how important it is that someone from the South, Pope Francis, has become the new leader of the church, someone who in the United States is perceived as a Latino pope, not just a Latin American pope, but as a Latino pope. Pope Francis is highly regarded by nearly half of the Catholic Church in the United States. 43% of all Catholics in this country are Hispanic, and Pope Francis is regarded as one of our own, someone whom we understand, who understands our roots, who understands our spirituality, who understands, and not only he understands who we are, but we understand where he comes from. So when we start looking at how Latinos, Latinas in the United States are welcoming the vision of Pope Francis for the entire church, I want to say something that I shared earlier with Father Alan Figueroa Deck, that in the United States, somehow in the Hispanic community, there was already a fertile ground to welcome the vision of Pope Francis. In many contexts in the church in this country, in many theological contexts, particularly in the academy, we speak about Francis as a break with perhaps different models of doing theology or different models of doing church or being church. But as a matter of fact, when we look at what's been happening in the Latino community for the last 50 years, what we see is a continuity of a movement that has been present in this country for almost five decades and even before. Let me just highlight 7 important movements among Hispanic Catholics in the United States that I believe have created this fertile ground to welcome and promote Pope Francis's vision. Number 1, Actus, the Academy of Catholic Hispanic Theologians of the United States, which was founded in 1988, and one of the founders is actually sitting right here. And Actus, from the beginning, has been a theological community committed to the development of hardcore theology, but theology that take the poor into consideration as a subject, not just as a mere object. But not only the poor, but also culture. In the United States, Latino, Latina theologians from the beginning have wrestled seriously with the idea of what it means to be Catholic, what it means to be American, but also what it means to be Latino, Latina in this country. So, and finally, we see that Actus has embraced a theological model of doing, or a model of doing theology that does theological reflection with, from, and for the people. 2, the second movement or phenomenon that is worth highlighting as part of this fertile ground, embracing Pope Francis's vision, is the constant use of the methodology See, Judge, Act, both at the ministerial level and theological reflection. When Pope Francis published his Evangelii Gaudium, one of the first highlights that commentators offered about the encyclical is the powerful, the beautiful use of the See, Judge, Act methodology. You see it in the entire encyclical. And when reading it, for Latinos, Latinas, it actually is music to our ears, because this is the kind of theological reflection that we've been doing in the United States for several decades. 3, the encuentros dynamic or movement. The encuentros have been gatherings, major gatherings of reflection, leaders, both pastoral and theological leaders, gathering at the national level after following processes of consultation in different parts of the country. 5 encuentros have taken place until today: 1972, 1977, 1985, and the year 2000. In the year 2000 and 2006, which actually focused on Hispanic youth. Right now, the church in the United States is engaged in a 5-year process leading or associated to the 5th National Encuentro. These encuentros, again, have created a space where we are able to imagine a new way of being church. And as a matter of fact, the 5th Encuentro is really grounding its reflections on the vision of Pope Francis, particularly on Evangelii Gaudium number 24, in which the Pope invites us not only to be a church that is looking at the world in life in a new way through the relationship with Jesus Christ, but looking at the church as a community that is always en salida, a community that goes forth. 4, the commitment to the new evangelization. When in 2012 we had the synod on the new evangelization, or when we had these 2 synods on the new evangelization, in many parts of the world, particularly the United States, North America, and Western Europe, the talk about the new evangelization was perceived as something revolutionary, something new. What is this new evangelization? But as a matter of fact, in Latin America and Latinos, Latinas in the United States have been engaging the concept of the new evangelization for several decades, as a matter of fact, since the early 1980s. Right, even 30 years, almost 30 years before there was an encyclical or a synod engaging the topic of the new evangelization, there were already documents by the US CCB and by leaders in the Hispanic community addressing the concept and the vision of the new evangelization. 5, the small ecclesial communities movement, which has been an incredible contribution to the life of the church. Latinos, Latinas in the United States, Latino, Latina Catholics, not only have welcomed and sustained an ecclesiology that remains rooted in the idea of small communities, but have also continued to grow with these communities and throughout the country. For instance, we have the contribution of Renew International, who builds its pastoral programs around about small ecclesial communities, and even to this day, evangelization happens in a very fruitful way by using this model. 6, the preferential options for those who live in the margins. Preferential options are not new to Latino Catholics. It's been part of what we are and who we are. In these preferential options for those who are in the margins, Pope Francis today talks about those who live in the peripheries. So we're using the similar language. But what are those preferential options in the United States? Preferential options for the poor, which we borrow from Medellin. But not only for the poor, but also for youth. Preferential option for immigrants. Preferential option for Latinas. Preferential option for urban workers. Preferential option for farm workers. Preferential option for exiles. So all these preferential options have shaped what we have done pastorally and theologically, at least for the last 40, 50 years. And finally, a contemporary reflection on Hispanic ministry. We are at the dawn of a new reflection of trying to understand what being Catholic is in the United States, and serious reflection is taking place all throughout the country, and certainly Boston College is one of the leading voices in this regard, as to how do we understand what it means to be Catholic today by looking at what's going on in the communities, in the pastoral life of the church, in the different structures and organizations of the church. The beauty of all this is that there is already a new generation of theologians and pastoral leaders, many of them Latinos, Latinas, who are embracing this dynamic. 40 years ago, when somebody asked about who are the Latino, Latina theologians, you could actually name those 5, 8 people. You could say Father Alan Figueroa Deck, Father Elizondo, Father Dr. Maria Pilar Aquino, and so forth. Today, more than 150 Latinos, Latinas in the United States have doctoral degrees in theology. Many of us are teaching in universities. Many of us are publishing, and we're helping to move this conversation forward. So my sense is that this is a unique opportunity for a dialogue with our sisters and brothers who are doing theology in the United States, especially Hispanics, to engage in creative dialogue with those who are doing likewise in Argentina, Brazil, El Salvador, Mexico, Puerto Rico, Colombia, Venezuela, and other countries in Latin America and the Caribbean where the message of Pope Francis resonates clearly and loudly. This dialogue tonight is an exercise of what Boston College is modeling for the entire country, for the entire continent. With these words, I want to welcome Father Galli.
Dear friends, good afternoon. I'm very pleased to meet you here in Boston College. I'm especially grateful to Dr. Thomas Grimm, to Dr. Hosman Ospino, and to Dr. Rafael Luciani for the invitation to this meeting, especially for your welcome and for your words. And I'm deeply grateful to the Boston College and to the Jesuit community. I'm very happy to be with you. This is my first time in the United States, and it's my third conference or lecture in English. This is my first spring in Boston. And I have forgotten my spring jacket in my room and take my winter jacket with me. And excuse me because my English pronunciation. I never speak English. I have learned in my old childhood, and this is my first experience with your language. Good. With these simple words, the question is Latin American intellectual roots of Pope Francis' pontificate. The election of Francis as Pope shows that the wind of God blows hard in the people of God from southern south. His missionary and reforming pontificate had its roots in both in the singular figure of the Argentine Jesuit Jorge Mario Bergoglio and its cultural roots in the Latin American Church and in the missionary project of the Conference of Aparecida. It is understood better if the Jesuit spiritualities Francis is known. The Holy Founder Ignatius Loyola and Pedro Fabro, the history of the Society of Jesus in Latin America and in the Guarani missions, and in the post-conciliar time, his authors and readings. This line we can see in the interview that the Jesuit Antonio Spadaro, director of the La Civiltà Cattolica, did to Francis 2 years ago. But Francis is better understood if we know the Church in Latin America speaks in Aparecida, and the incipient but promising Argentine theology in the post-conciliar stage. Francis is a pastor, and is a pastoral theologian. We say un pastoralista. Before becoming bishop, being rector of Colegio Máximo in Argentina, he founded and was the first pastor of St. Joseph's Parish in San Miguel, where he promoted the barrios evangelization. At the same time, he taught pastoral theology and spoke about exhortation Evangelii Nuntiandi by Blessed Pope Paul VI in the Faculty of Theology in the Colegio Máximo. So we cannot disqualify him saying that he is not a theologian. Theology is not only a systematic reflection or a systematic theology. Yes, it is, but also a pastoral and spiritual theology. I will expound Latin American roots of Pope Francis, including historical, cultural, spiritual, theological, and pastoral source. The speech will have an undulating rhythm between the profile of Pope Francis and his framework, his Latin America framework. The itinerary will follow 6 steps or points. Latin America, our church, our pastoral theology, the message of Aparecida, the theology in Argentina, and the synthesis of Francis, church in missionary conversion. I especially appreciate the words of Rafael and Josman about this theme. First, Latin America. Latin America is located at the crossroads between North and South, between East and West. Our region belongs culturally to Western world, both traditional and modern, and also is part of the South, marked by poverty and inequality. Integrating the Americas, it is the only Christian southern region, poor, and still the subcontinent more homogeneously Catholic in the West. In all America, or the Americas, the primacy of the religious factor marks a certain Christian unity. But there are enormous socioeconomic inequalities between rich and poor. The churches are called to be sacrament of caritas and of solidarity communion and promote an American community fairer. The church expressed in Aparecida awareness of belonging to an original community. Latin America is one and plural. It's the common house, the great homeland of brothers, of peoples, to whom the same geography, Christian faith, language, and culture have finally united in the way of history. Latin America is a plural unit. With its many local differences, this region is an original history from its linguistic, geopolitical, cultural, and religious common factors, past events, and present realities. There is more affinity between two endpoints of Latin America, for example, Cuba or Mexico, Chile and Uruguay, that between distant countries in Europa, Africa, or Asia. The Catholic Church is at the origin of the name Latin America, because it was the first institution in the world that used the Latin America appellation. In 1858, the Latin American Church founded in Rome a residence to train our clergy, and 7 years after, this college, Latin America Pius College. In 1899, the Pope Leo XIII met the first Latin American Plenary Council. In the last century, 1949, in Mexico, was published the journal Latin America by the Jesuits, which linked thinkers like José Vasconcelos or San Alberto Hurtado in Chile, or Monseñor de Risi in Argentina. This name unites us with all American people, including those with other cultural backgrounds, but distinguishes us from the Latin root, from who has Anglo-Saxon root. We are brothers with different traditions and cultures. But we have heard in this moment go on a process of encounter of cultures here in the United States. The Latin America culture is a cultural mestizaje. I say with the Spanish word, mestizaje. Bergoglio has spoken about India's Baroque, el barroco indiano, o el barroco jesuita, taking an expression of Venezuelan Mariano Picón Salas, who paints us with an original color among other cultural matrices. Latin America and Caribbean region is the most urbanized in the world. 8 of 10 persons live in urban areas, most in periphericals, barrios. Our pastoral theology is dedicated to think a new urban pastoral care. Francis is the first pope of a global society that thinks the tensions between the local and the global. In my book, God Lives in the City, I show that Bergoglio was the first Archbishop of Buenos Aires, fully urban. In 1936, when he was born into a family of Italian migrants, my city had 2,400,000 inhabitants. Today, the metropolitan area exceeds 13 million of people. Francis is the first pope born in a big city of the 20th century. To the Latin American Church. Our church lives in a kairos because a son of this church, Latin American and Latino, and Argentino, is the successor of Saint Peter. The Holy Spirit blows where it wills and has blown as strongest of wine. South wind blows. Francis was chosen when war peripheries were in the heart of the city, of the church. He represents the arrival of the South at the church heart, and he showed it, for example, in the United States, the global South in the world. With Francis, Latin American church complete their entry into world history. A friend of Bergoglio, the Uruguayan historian Alberto Metol Ferré, in 1973 wrote, I quote, "What does the church in Latin America will have a huge role in the Third World. And while Latin America will decisively influence the destiny of the church in Europe, and Latin America and the church have a great chance, and I believe that through our church happens somehow the chance of the world church." This was written in the year 73. The chance of the church war, renewal passed through Latin America, and that burdened us with a grave responsibility. The Pilgrim Church in Latin America has a regional physiognomy outlined in the second half of the 20th century by the particular churches grouped at national level and for the service of the Holy See and the Latin America Episcopate Council, CELAM, which brings together 22 bishoprics coordinated by CELAM. The CELAM celebrates its 60th year in the last 2015. The church in Latin America picked up the teaching of Paul VI in his exhortation Evangelii Nunciandi, and also his teaching about the popular piety or religion of the people, Evangelii Nunciandi 48. Latin American Church and Pastoral Theology contemplates the mystical heart of the pilgrim people of God among the poor of our peoples. I agree with Raphael and his words about this theme. The popular Catholic spirituality expresses the Christian, Marian, and mystical heart of the people of God in Latin America. It is impossible to understand the church in our subcontinent without the mysteries of Christ and Mary. God wanted that Latin America will be a Marian subcontinent. Our people found the tenderness and love of God in the face of Mary. The Argentine theology contributes to put in the first place the popular religiosity or piety or spirituality. Third, the Latin American pastoral theology. The pastoral theology thinks from the faith the pastoral action of the Church in the history. Theology, pastoral, or practice is a theological discourse on evangelization action. Considers the evangelization practice of the whole people of God in the broadest sense of pastoral were used by the Second Vatican Council. Latin American pastoral theology, including Argentina reflection, linking, the others speakers said, history, theology, and pastoral reflection. Also, the pastoral Francis discourse has theological roots and spiritual reasons. His exhortation, Evangelii Gaudium, mentions the ecclesial and evangelical theological work function. The Church in Latin America have many pastoral values. For example, the richness of its popular piety, its sense of release, the integral sense of release, the struggle for human dignity, an affective and symbolic culture in the life of faith and his transmission, the strength of the option for the poor, the subjectivity of the particular or local churches, and the organic pastoral projects, the multitude of small ecclesial communities, comunidades de base o comunidades cristianas, biblical animation of pastoral care, and a missionary dynamic ad intra and ad extra. But the Church in Latin America must continue along the path of conversion, recognizing their sins and infidelities to the gospel, for the grace of developing the potential of personal and community missionary holiness. 4. The message of Aparecida. I have 10 minutes, no? The theme of the conference of Aparecida was formulated in a phrase, disciples and missionaries of Jesus Christ, so that our peoples have life in Him, in Christ. And a motto, I am the way, the truth, and the life. The novelty of Francis' pontificate is related to the novelty of Aparecida. Yesterday, Bergoglio contributed to Aparecida. Today, Aparecida contributes to Francis. Pope takes lines of Aparecida and creatively relaunches its missionary program. But Francis does not seek to export a Latin American model, but each church, local church, to assume the mission of an inculturate way, their time and their place. Otherwise, it would fall into another form of pastoral centralism that we want. The theology of Aparecida thinks the mission as communication of the fullness life in Christ. The Church has its specific mission, communicate the life of Jesus Christ to all people. Aparecida invokes the Holy Spirit so that raise a new Pentecost for an essentially missionary evangelization, and thus include the pastoral conversion, the firm missionary decision that should permeate all ecclesial structures and all pastoral plans of Christians, Catholic communities. The Latin American Church in Aparecida express a missionary movement arising from the nature of the Pilgrim Church on path of renewal, conversion, and evangelization to the kingdom of God. Francis take this important line of a missionary church in his pontificate. Aparecida is a synthesis of Latin American pastoral theology and one of the strongest roots of pastoral thinking of Pope Francis. In his exhortation Evangelii Gaudium, Pope cites 20 times the document of Aparecida. With his pontificate, the dynamics of missionary conversions promoted by the Latin America periphery makes its contribution to the reform of the whole Church. This confirms what said by Yves Congar in the year 1950. Many reforms come forth from the peripheries. A little word about the theology of the people and of the people of God that we have together heard. Pope Francis said that he likes the image of the Church as the holy, faithful people of God. It is the definition that he used more and is taken from number 12 of the Constitution Lumen Gentium. The novelty of his pontificates include a small novelty of wider dissemination of our Argentine theology. Theology of the people of God. Francis speak about the people of God and the people with two meanings. In the chapter 3 of Evangelii Gaudium, he spoke about the Church as the pilgrim people of God in history and incarnate in cultures. And in the chapter 4, he develops 4 principles that help us to build a culture of contact in social life. And then he spoke about the people, the civilian people. That is the two meanings that the Argentine theology speak about the people. The Church as people of God, the society, the human society, as a people with history, culture, and destiny. The two meanings of term people you can think in your North American experience. If you say the American people or the American dream, think of the American people. If you speak about the people of God, of the God's people, speak about the Church of God, the Church of Christ. In his pastoral visit to United States, Francis used both meaning depending of their partners. Addressing the members of the Church referred to the holy people of God. To expose members of Congress referred to the cultural values of the nation, recalling four great figures whom he called four representatives of the spirit of the American people: Abraham Lincoln, Martin Luther King, Dorothy Day, and Thomas Merton. These two meanings of people are two meanings that Pope Francis developed in his magisterium or teaching. In this sense, we speak about the popular Catholic piety or spirituality. It's popular in the two meanings: belong to the poor people or the culture of the poor people, and belong to the church as people of God. That is the two meaning of popular piety or spirituality in Aparecida and by Francis. In this sense, we must think about the inculturate theology in relation to the Catholic popular piety. This leads us to a particular way of doing inculturate theology. The relationship between the sensus fidei, popular piety, listening to the people, and the reform of the church are ways that we must follow together. Finally, sixth point, I have 3 minutes. Thank you, and I apologize because my English language. Francis' synthesis: Church as people of God in missionary conversion. Francis' pontificate is a new beginning of reform promoted by the Vatican II. With his reception of the Council and the reform of the Church, not just the Curia, the whole Church, enter a new phase. The decisive question is the hermeneutics of reform. Pope Francis is interested in continuity, certainly, but I said particularly continuity of conciliar reform, particularly continuity of conciliar reform. For Francis, the Vatican II made a rereading of the Gospel in the life of contemporary culture and promote a dynamic reform or renewal irreversible. In his message to the Curia last December 21, the Pope said, "The reform will go ahead with determination, clarity, and resolution, because Ecclesia semper reformanda." In this sense, in an interview, the Pope added, "For me, the great revolution is to go to the roots." We speak about roots. To the roots, to the source. To go to the roots, to recognize them and see what those roots have to say today. Is the two meanings of reform or renewal. Ressourcement, by the return to the sources, and aggiornamento, by updating. The double meaning there is for him, reform is perceived. The pastoral conversion is a permanent movement in the direction of the reform of the Church. I can speak about this because in October, with Father Antonio Spadaro, we have organized a meeting, a congress, about the reform of the Church in La Civiltà Cattolica, with 30 theologians, historians, canonistic, and pastoral theologians. And the lectures and the papers of this Congress will be published by Queriniana in the collection of contemporary theology in 2 months. In this sense, the reform is missionary conversion, but is personal, community, and structurality. Missionary conversion of the whole people of God and of all by us in the people of God. Francis, in this sense, wants a church in outreach to the peripheries of the world, to the geographic, social, and existential peripheries of the world. To end, nomen is omen. The person is the mission is the person. The first Jesuit Pope chose the name of the Poverello, Francis von Assisi. He espoused in this name 3 of his traits: love the poor from the embrace Lady Poverty, Pacific Charisma inscription on the theme Peace and Good, Paz y Bien, brotherhood with creation in singing praise of creatures. The name Francis responds symbolically to 3 drums of today's humanity: poverty, peace, creation, or car creation. In chapter 4 of Evangelii Nuntiandi, he faced the issues of the poor and peace, these 2 questions. And in the encyclical Laudato Si, he considers the correlation between the cry of the poor and the cry of the earth. Yes, to sum up, Francis mentioned, I mentioned 2 keys of Francis' pontificate. Pope Francis announced a time of joy that can be put in parallel with the called time of mercy. Tenderness revolutions began with incarnations of the Son of God, but is a characteristic of the contemporary Church after the Vatican II. In his Christmas message in Buenos Aires, Bergoglio said, staring at the image of the child Jesus, that God is tenderness. I think thus the mercy is the hermeneutical principle of his pontificate. And to end, the time of joy had a symbolic beginning with the inaugural address of Pope John the 23rd. At the council, the address called Gaudet Mater Ecclesia, Gaudet. He continued with the Constitution, Gaudium et Spes. The Church in the contemporary world. And continue with the exhortation on Paul VI, Gaudete in Domino. And continue today with the programmatic exhortation of Pope Francis, Evangelii Gaudium, on in this week, we can say, continued by the new exhortation that call Amoris Laetitia. Laetitia, Gaudium, joy. In this sense, Bergoglio meditated and wrote about a phrase of Pope Montini in Evangelii Nuntiandi 80, the sweet and comforting show of evangelization. He cited 3 times this phrase in the previous interventions on the conclave. Then be repeated in his exhortation program. Showing is a sign of the gospel, an expression of the Latin American church and culture, and a summary of the pastoral spirituality of Pope Francis. Joy, the joy of the gospel, is the great root of his pontificate. He said, Evangelii Gaudium 21, and finish, the gospel joy which enlives the community of disciples is a missionary joy. That is our joy. Thank you very much.
Muchas gracias, Padre. Wonderful. It's a revolution. It really is. And what a welcome one it is for our church. And isn't it marvelous that it arises from the faith life of the ordinary people, from poor people, that will save us, in a sense. And I suppose I'm sitting there thinking that if there is some sign of hope for our North American church, that there is the possibility in the catechesis that we attempt to do that engages people's lives and tries to move from life to faith and to life again. I was sitting there thinking, maybe there could be hope for us as a people and as for the faith life of our people. But it's a tremendous gift that we're receiving, and an exciting one, and a joy-filled one. It's an extraordinary moment. I'm going to suggest, I know we've been sitting a while, but I love people to have a little chat with each other. Take 1 minute, because we are going to end by about 7:30, and we want a little conversation with Father Galli, or 7:35 maybe. Take a minute or two and turn to a neighbor, a little solidarity, as Raphael was saying, and tell them whatever you're thinking. How does your response? What have you come to hear? What have you come to see for yourself from the fine introductions and then from Father Galli's comments? What's going on in your heart? Maybe take a moment, share with your neighbor, then we'll re-engage Father Galli for about 10 minutes. We'll blame the Irish, Alan. Let's regather, and Father Galli, if you would, and maybe Raphael and Hosman as well, be on your feet, and let's engage the conversation with Father Galli and with Hosman and Raphael as well, as your pleasure is. Let's take your comments, questions, observations, whatever it is in your heart. And I'm going to put on my glasses, and then we may be able to see if you drop your hand. Somebody have a contribution for us, or a comment to Father Galli, or a question, an answer, whatever.
Yourself. One thought here that we were talking about, among others, we got very engaged. Sorry,
No, you're fine.
Yeah, one thought that struck us, and we got very engaged very fast, is that sometimes
someone can say something where we think we hear one thing and they're actually saying another. Popular, popular. When someone hears Pope Francis in Spanish, en español, they understand that he's speaking about all the people, which most emphatically includes the poor, el pobre. But for us as Norteamericanos or Irish Americans, popular never means we're talking about the poor people. It's not there. So sometimes there are dimensions to popular speech that will have to be re-evangelized for us to have a raising of consciousness.
Another comment?
I think one particular point that we discussed was the different personality of Pope Francis. And this morning you talked about how, in a way, Pope Francis is, I can't remember the term you used, but basically not seeing the papacy as so sacred, and so that a comment can be made and then retracted, or that something can be done in a different way. And that this is revolutionary. It's showing that the Pope is a human person who can make mistakes or who can decide to do things in a different mode. And I think that for folks who have seen the papacy as this untouchable, completely infallible thing can be a little scary. But if you know the Hispanic Latin American culture, you know that it's just. It just is. You speak up. You make comments. You can retract. It's very engaging. It's more about just the direct communication than the very precise. Everything needs to be perfectly planned out before it's done. And so, I think having that in mind could potentially take away a lot of the fear that I think folks have with regards to Pope Francis and what is he doing and why is he doing this. And in a way, he's just being Latino. He's being, which is a beautiful thing. It's a beautiful culture. I mean, it's one that's very open, very eager to engage, very eager to have the encuentro. And I think it's a beautiful thing that's missing sometimes here in the United States in this context.
Thank you. Great point.
I actually have a question, Tom.
Please.
Oh, great. No, go ahead.
We're taking.
My question is very simple.
Maybe we get you the microphone. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, and then Pops.
So, Professor Galli, a pleasure to have you here, un placer terlo acá. A simple question, although you're not a Jesuit, aunque no seas un jesuita, pero lo conoces muy bien, a little bit of the Ignatian spirituality of Pope Francis, un poquito de la espiritualidad franciscana de Francisco con tus ojos.
Because he's the first Jesuit Pope in 500 years, and he'll probably be the last Jesuit Pope.
and the last Argentine Pope.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for yours questions and comments. Thank you very much. The first theme is the notion of people. For the Argentine theology, people in the secular or civilian meaning has these two aspects or components: all and the poor. But the poor included in all the people, in the whole people. No descartados, marginalized of the people. And Father Lucio Gera and Father Rafael Tello have spoken about the poor as or like the heart of the people. These two meanings are, we must think these two meanings in his correlation sense. That is one of the reasons because the Pope speaks about a poor church and a church to the poor or for the poor. The church must be poor, and this is a challenge for all, for our church and for your church. That means that all should be or must be in the church as in his own home. ¿Lo digo bien? In his own home. In this meaning, when the Pope speaks about the culture of encounter, or in the Congress or with the North American bishop, he spoke about the school of encounter. We are in one school, the school of encounter. But what is encounter for Francis? What is the meaning of encounter? Encounter is integration. Encounter is dialogue. Encounter is inclusion. These things, different aspects of a cultural of encounter. We can say in the cultural view, that intercultural and interculturally society must be a culture of encounter, of intercultural, and not only pluricultural. Intercultural society must be animated by a culture of encounter. The second comment, I sincerely, especially grateful for your comment. The Pope is a human being, but only a Pope can change the papacy. ¿Lo dije bien? Many theologians have written about the reform of papacy, and many are friends of mine. For example, Severino Dianic of Italy, or Hermann Pottmeyer of Münster. I am friend for these great theologians, of Hervé Legrand of Paris. But many can't write about the reform of papacy, but only a pope can't reform the papacy. One pope, two popes, three popes, and a succession of popes in the same way. And one of these ways is the desacralization, ¿se dice? La desacralización de lo que no es sagrado. ¿Cómo se? To desacralize what is not sacred. What is not sacred. But the image of the Pope is, in a sense, sacred, but in other sense, must not be sacred. And in the Italian people said when a speak about the Pope, say the Pope Francis. We, the Argentines, say Francis, but the Italians said Pope Francis. But say Pope Francis is like I, se dice, o me, like me, is one of us, is us, is like us. And this is a revolution in the vision of the papacy. And in this sense, I think that we must say thank you very much to Pope Benedict, because we have frequently sede vacante, ¿cómo se dice? Vacancy, the Holy See, because a Pope dead or is died. But with the resignation of Pope Benedict, we have sede vacante because comienza a morir, start to end a wave of the Pope. No ha muerto un papa, ha muerto o ha comenzado a morir, a cambiar una forma de ser papa. Y el papa puede equivocarse, ciertamente, y esto es bueno para la Iglesia. Y que el papa predique los días de semana, ¿quieres traducirlo? Que el papa predique los días de semana. Thank you.
With Pope Benedict's resignation, no, so what we find ourselves is not at a point in history in which, a pope dies and then there's a vacancy, but what's dying this time is a way of being pope. So in a sense, Benedict has opened a new path.
Además, el Papa Francisco transmite la fe como los latinoamericanos y latinos transmitimos la fe. Es una transmisión a través de una cultura afectiva de la fe. Y esto ayuda a sentirlo como un hermano entre los hermanos.
Pope Francis shares the faith and lives out the papacy like Latin Americans do, with emphasis on the affective and the relational, and that's what allows us to perceive the papacy in an entirely new way.
A few last questions. The Francis spirituality. Yeah, first, he has an Ignatian and Jesuit spirituality, and this is clear. For example, he pray and at morning and at afternoon with the Ignatian method of praying. But that is an important aspect that who know the Pope, we are witness of his spirituality, that he is a man of God, because he take his decisions in the praying, in the climate of the praying. The pray, ¿está bien? The pray is the framework of his important decisions, but is the framework of the discernment, ¿se dice? Discernment of the great decisions for the Church. But Franciscan spirituality, I think that there is a parallelism between Pope John and Pope Francis in many aspects or points, topics. For example, the two popes began his pontificates with a visit to the presos en una cárcel.
To the prisoners in a jail.
Pope John to the prison Regina Coeli, and Pope Francis in the Holy Thursday with the washing foods. But Pope John said 1 month before the council, in the poor or in developments, subdesarrollados countries, the church must be the church of the poor. And Francis, in his first press conference, said, I desire a church poor and for the poor. And one of the aspects in this parallelism between the two popes is the Franciscan spirituality. That belongs to the spirituality of Pope John, and that belongs to the spirituality of Pope Francis. In an interview to the director of the Republic, La Repubblica, this journal of Italy, Scalfaro, Pope Francis speaks about his saints, his preferred saints, Saint Paul, Saint Francis, San Ignacio, and Santa Teresa of Lisieux. He mentioned these 4 saints and others. The last question. The Pope think the history, the time and the history, el tiempo y la historia, as a process. He has meditated so much about the mystery of the time. In the chapter 4 of his exhortation, he speaks about the priority of the time over the place, sobre el espacio. And he remains one phrase of the Saint Pedro Fabro, or Pedro Fabro. The time is a messenger of God. This reflection about the time, el tiempo, and about the history conduce the Pope Francis to believe and think that in the Church we must begin process and begin irreversible process. A question is a Pope of projects or is a Pope of process? And there are different opinions about this question, but I say it's a Pope of process and projects, of project and process. And he begin a new phase of a process that's come first before the Vatican II, has the key in the Vatican II and in the post-conciliar age, and have so many links and shadows, lights and shadows, lights and shadows. But for this reason, I said, Francis began a new phase of the reform of the Church in the way of Vatican II. It's a project and it's a process. But we all are invited for him to work in this way. Thank you very much.